broadcast channel 21. Madam City Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
This is Mike Sugg, functioning as city clerk tonight, and I will start us off with Mayor Karen Moran, who I believe is absent this evening. Deputy Mayor Christy Malchow.
Present.
Councilmember Ken Gamblin is absent this evening. Councilmember Jason Ritchie.
I'm here, thank you.
Councilmember Chris Ross. Councilmember Chris Ross.
Sam Stewart. He's present.
Okay.
I heard him.
Yuri?
Now we can hear you. Thank you. Councilmember Pamela Stewart.
I'm here. Thanks.
And Councilmember Kent Treen is
Great.
absent.
So we do have a quorum, just barely. So thank you for those of you that were able to make it. Councilmember Ross, can I ask you to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please?
I pledge allegiance
to the
flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible,
with liberty
and justice for all.
Councilmember Stewart, thanks for your flag there because I'm sitting in my car and I don't have a flag. So thanks. I was able to look at yours.
People ask me why I got a flag, and I said because it feels weird to say the pledge without one.
It does indeed. If I could get a motion for approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, so moved and seconded. Any discussion? Okay, seeing none. All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed? Okay, approval is passed. Next, we have public comment. Pursuant to the Governor's Emergency Proclamation 20-25, the city is unable to provide an in-person location for the public to listen to the virtual City Council meeting this evening. Meetings are still accessible to the public, and the public comment is able to be submitted. Written comment may be accepted until 5 p.m. on the day of the meeting. Submit your written comments by email to the city clerk at lhachey@sammamish.us and the city council at citycouncil@sammamish.us. Verbal comment is up to 3 minutes and may be provided per person live during the meeting. Call the following number and input the access code when prompted by 6:30 p.m. the day of the meeting. The phone number is 1-571-317-3122, and the access code is 929-348-197. Once you have joined, you will be placed on mute. The meeting operator will unmute you when it is your turn to comment. You will hear an automated voice say unmuted when that occurs, and the operator will ask you to begin comment. Mr. Sugg, do we have anyone that is present for public comment?
Deputy Mayor, there are no callers tonight for public comment.
All right. Seeing no public comment, we will move to the consent calendar. Do I have a motion for approval of the consent?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any changes? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
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 I think I only heard 3. Nays?
I think we all said aye.
Okay, all right. Then by a vote of 4-0, we have approved the consent calendar. Our only agenda item is unfinished business, and this is relative to the preliminary budget. I'm going to turn it over to the city manager, and staff is going to give a presentation, and they have asked that we allow them to go through their entire presentation, and then we will do our Q&A at the end of that if that's okay with council. Okay, very good. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor and council members. I am going to go through a written overview that'll be supplemented here and there with some slides, and then I'll recap with staff some of the key elements that I wanted to be sure that we covered, and then turn it back over to you and the council members for any additional questions and inquiries. We've had a series of discussions on the budget going as far back as August of this year. I've asked for input on the operational side of the budget as well as the capital side of the budget. We met again in October, where I provided the council a proposed budget package. The council has in turn asked many questions, which the staff and I have tried to provide direct written answers to your questions. Even some questions from the public have been responded to. We are here again to continue to answer questions and once again provide you an overview of the proposed budget, as well as what I will call a stripped down version without my proposed revenue fixes. I hope you have all the opportunity to gauge with one another over the key policy issues the budget requires to become balanced. To be clear, I feel I am held to a higher standard that requires me to provide you my best efforts in providing and presenting a balanced budget, given the tools and resources available, and addresses the goals I perceive the City Council has declared in some fashion or another. So let me start at stating the city needs a strategic plan. This strategic plan would not only create a mission statement, but it identifies goals and objectives to make it clear to the reader, the community, and the employees what is most important to the leadership of the city. Without it, the organization is less balanced, and it is less clear what the priorities are and what direction we are headed in. This is where I found myself when I arrived, trying to assume the role of interim city manager and then permanent city manager. And as I put the budget together and reflected back on the last 9 months, I wanted to add that as something the council considers at their retreat in January, is developing a strategic plan. What assisted me to a significant degree in my arrival here was my many years as a city manager, approximately 14 years of actual experience as a city manager. In addition to those 14 years, I was surprised at this, but I have nearly 38 years of complex departmental and multi-departmental budgets. Those 14 years as city manager also assist me in helping the city councils develop, identify, and execute sound public policy. However, when there are unusual or catastrophic events or disasters, plans, goals, objectives, and projects can quickly diminish into dust. Within a day or two of assuming my new position, I was asked if I thought a hiring freeze was appropriate, as there was concern expressed by some council members that the city was deficit spending and expenses needed to be put under control. My answers was that I have budgeted through some very significant and impactful economic downturns and through recovery, and I closely review all open positions before I allow any to be filled. I stated that I would do the same here in Sammamish, and that I did not need a hiring freeze to help me do the job I felt I was being paid to do. Just because there are openings, I always make sure that there is not a program for auto-filling the vacancies. I've seen that happen. I immediately informed all my department heads and my HR staff that there will be no auto-filling of vacancies, and there still isn't that today. Each department requesting to fill a position requires to submit written justification and then get approval by me before any hiring can occur. That's just a side note, a precursor of where we're going. Within 10 days of my arrival, COVID hit King County. A week or so after COVID hit, I could see that the potential economic impacts that could befall the region and the nation. I put a freeze on all hiring myself, a freeze I could control. I quickly got myself up to speed on our tax revenue sources, and I could quickly see that we were much differently situated than most other communities in King County, but it was not yet clear what kind of a hit we were going to take. Employee salary savings was my most immediate and direct way of offsetting any potential sales tax losses from businesses being closed down. My budget message mentions the fact that the sales tax impacts we still suffer from are primarily from our decision to place a moratorium on much of the development as we sort through the Growth Management Hearing Board decision. And we have made up for much of the losses of sales tax from retail sales through a marked increase in internet sales. Whereas we have many businesses that continue to struggle, the city municipal government is stable and fiscally affected only slightly, approximately $400,000 per staff's best estimates. So this past week, I was again asked if I felt there was a need for a council to put a hiring freeze in place. My answer is much the same as it was before: no. I added that putting a hiring freeze in place sometimes is necessary to send a message to the community, send a message to the workforce, and to affect an overall strategy and calming of control to the community. We have none of that, and we have no need for that message or action. We have a healthy economy, and while anything can happen on a national level or global level that changes this, I see housing prices as stable and sales are still brisk. Unemployment is still good with the exception of those that are negatively impacted by COVID. And yes, I believe we are in for a long-term recovery from COVID, and I'm not blind to the rising cases on a local, regional, national, and global level. We must practice safety and to lessen the impacts. This will still not significantly impact us such that we need to panic. We are much better suited to withstand the economic hits of this pandemic than many of our neighbors here in King County because of how revenues are built here. They are built on the value of our residential properties. So no hiring freeze is necessary. I still watch over every position closely, and we have some positions that are being held open due to timing as I try to reorganize. Some are open due to job descriptions and labor negotiations, and some are held open as we measure the impacts of the new wave of COVID. Whatever is not filled will roll over to budget savings, which has always been the case. I've had to lay off positions in the past, and I never want to have to go through that again, so I watch things very closely. I need the flexibility to take a slow and measured approach, or to do what I had to do this week, and that was to act quickly and decisively, as I just received the resignation of our city engineer, who is going to move out of state, and I needed to get a recruitment moving now. I have thoughtfully and methodically managed this city over the past 9 months, as one would expect an active and involved city manager to do, all while balancing workflow, staying focused on effectiveness and efficiency, and dealing with the priorities of projects, all while converting a full-time and fully occupied City Hall and Maintenance Operations Center to remote working schedules wherever possible, and to continue to serve the public. And this staff has done it well. The challenge continues, and we will continue on this path well into spring and summer. I am presenting a recommended budget as it is important for the sake of the process, but I'm also going to present a very stripped-down version so that the City Council can see the structural deficit the city is facing, which has been the case for some time, and can contemplate how or if it wants to address it, but not until I provide a recap of some areas where costs have risen significantly and must be pointed out to the council. The stripped-down format has no recommended assistance or additional revenues so that the council can make the necessary policy decisions that they are required to get us to a balanced budget and that they are comfortable with. That might be by using the available fund balance for capital projects as recommended, or it may be by using some of the bank capacity, or it may be a combination of the two. I want to briefly go back through my proposed budget so that I can contrast and compare the 2020 budget to the proposed budget, as some of you wanted more explanation. Beyond the complete monthly finance reports we've been providing you on an actual expenditures each month. Now, this is a very high-level view. If you want to get into more detail, then I look to you to do that through your questions. I want to show you where the significant changes were between the 2020 budget and the 2021 budgets. As I shared with you, there is consistently been a $3 million contingency fund in the non-departmental fund that is there for one-time expenditures. I've used it this last year, and this has provided money to assist with legal counsel for Mr. Peter Eglick for the Jaron matter, as well as for the EIS to deal with the Jaron Growth Management Hearing Board matter. It's provided us about $28,000 for an organizational management review of administrative services, where I found functions that had been widely dispersed from where they were previously centralized. And for these past few years, I believe that we have been at risk, and when they need to be brought back together to reduce costs, reduce risk, and for better management oversight and effectiveness. Whereas I do believe there are benefits from this type of fund, I could not incorporate it into this proposed budget as a recommendation, as the budget was growing due to increased costs of operations. So I left it out for a separate discussion for council as you try to deal with other large policy issues of using reserves to balance or of raising taxes. So right now, let's take a look at the slide where some of these increased costs are found. We've got a slide here that will show you that $3 million in contingency. A couple council members said, well, where did that money go? Well, where was it reallocated? And money really...
Dave, I'm sorry, this is Jason. Excuse me. We're not seeing a slide here. Is anybody else seeing a slide?
Yeah, it's just slow to come.
There's a slide up now. To flip suddenly.
Do you see it now, Jason?
I'm not.
Yeah, but it's not relative to what you're talking about.
It says major expense increased
Yes.
by department is what I see.
He's talking about a $3 million contingency fund. So.
Yep.
The comparison to adopted 2020?
Slide 7 on the number
just-
on the top is showing on my screen.
What is showing there is where costs significantly increased over the 2020 budget. Okay, so I'm not going to do a line item by line item comparison here. What I'm showing you is in police services, they are up about $1 million. Parks and facilities.
And again, Dave, I know we're supposed to save our questions, but this is compared to budget, not actuals. Is that correct?
Yes.
So we still don't have any actuals. We're not going to compare to what we actually spent.
We'll draft those up for you tomorrow, but this is compared to budget,
Okay.
and we'll pull out the actuals that we've been providing on a monthly basis. Police services is up about $1 million. Parks and facilities is up about $1 million. You can see that $600,000 in the way of facilities, repairs, projects, professional services. The Fire Station 81 apron and some other facility repairs is $400,000 of that. $220,000 in park maintenance and $50,000 in your art strategic plan. Another area is the budget is up about $1.7 million in public works, and you can see where those costs have been distributed. $600,000 in traffic, $300,000 in other capital increases distributed in the organization, and the other listing there to give you a good idea where those other monies went.
I'm sorry, do we have a copy of this presentation, or we just have what's on the screen?
We'll provide it to you.
Okay, thanks.
So I wanted to show you where the significant changes occurred in relationship to not having that $3 million in contingencies. And what we've tried to focus on here is where things have increased and why, and operational costs have just risen. You're always going to have actuals will be less, and we'll provide that to just as we went back and revisited this. There wasn't time to go back through and do the detailed comparisons as I'd hoped we'd be able to do, but I think these significant areas and the policy decisions the council has to face is where I would recommend that you put your focus. Regarding the recommendations for an increase in the policing force, as you recall, the city conducted a study that was completed in 2018. Where's the chief? Okay. That study had recommended the highest ranking officer be a major, and that we retain the captain position for overall supervision, and that we had 2 additional officers be added, as it mentioned the town center was anticipated to proceed with construction on an aggressive schedule. There has been no increase in the number of police officers since that study was released. And the town center has been delayed by the developer for one reason or another, and it's currently going through a application review right now. So upon the arrival of Chief Pengray in December of 2019, through his interviews, he shared a vision that was less costly. And I have Chief Pengray here this evening, who is now able to provide some history and some insight to his management of the Sammamish PD. Chief.
Hey, Council, can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Okay. So just as a quick review, so when I came in to interview for the position of chief and had reviewed the police services study, one of the recommendations was to make this position the equivalent of a major's position with the King County Sheriff's Office, which would then still require a captain to be here. And that's in addition to still having the administrative sergeant, which would either have been kept in that format or potentially changed to a patrol supervisor position. And at the time with all of you, when this was discussed, I tried to emphasize that I just didn't think that made a lot of sense for the city. It didn't address the needs of the city and of the PD, which were for patrol personnel and enhanced supervision. And I didn't think that it justified the significant increases in costs to the city budget. So that was one area that, again, I had discussed with most of you, and I still maintain that that's the right decision. In following up on what the study said, as the city manager just mentioned, that there was a recommendation of adding personnel. And it was a combination. It was as a result of anticipated increases in the town center. But in addition to that, there's never been any type of relief factor set up in our current patrol personnel. So it was mentioned, at least when I had spoken with the previous chief, that those were some of the discussions, that we were so minimally staffed. And there was a recommendation that additional staff occur immediately. I believe it was 2, and then over the next 2 years, an additional 2 bodies. And to date, there has been no adds. So population has still increased. Calls for service have still increased. And so, again, my focus and my recommendation is that we do add the minimal supervision and staffing that we're requesting this budget in order to address some of the relief factor, overtime, and just the ability to respond with Sammamish PD officers to Sammamish residents. In addition to that area, we've tried to make some adjustments to address the needs of personnel. We completely changed how we staffed shifts so that things were more consistent. But again, we only have 18 patrol personnel assigned to the city, and that's exactly what it takes to meet minimum staffing. During COVID, we have had the opportunity to take advantage of our school resource officers. We have spread them out to begin at 4 o'clock in the morning and end at 5 o'clock p.m. And that's all 3 of those school resource officers staggered throughout the day. This has significantly helped in reducing overtime and enhancing patrol during the daytime hours, Monday through Friday. Again, helping us to reduce overtime overall. Also, as a result of COVID, I have intentionally held some positions vacant over and above what the number is and has been agreed upon with the sheriff's office. And the end result, and we've been allowed to do that since we reduced some of our on-view activity, and calls for service have reduced overall compared to last year, although they're still steady. And again, there's many factors involved with that. But because we've been able to add the school resource officers, I've intentionally held vacancies, which ultimately results in a reconciliation from the sheriff's office over the period of 2020. And as mentioned by the city manager, those savings will come back to the overall budget. And we don't have a calculated number yet, but Aaron would be able to provide that to you once the county gives us that information. And again, in addition to just because of where we're at right now and really trying to look at what's best for the city and still save money, we have a 3-person minimum, which is necessary. But after 12 o'clock at night or 12 o'clock a.m., I did a thorough review of our calls, our dispatch calls for service, and they are minimal. The number of reportable calls, in other words, reports that would be taken, are again minimal. So as a result of that, I've taken advantage of still having 3 Sammamish personnel out in the field after 12 a.m., but we've included the supervisor that can be a first responder. This doesn't violate any union issues and still addresses the needs of the city. I have left it up to the supervisors if they determine based on the type of night it is, calls for service, et cetera, or if there's calls that have been holding, that they can go ahead and staff up accordingly. And if there's no supervisor available, then we will staff up to 3. So that's just a few of the things that we've done to try and address what's happening. And then ultimately, last but not least, but again with the school resource officers and anticipating a delay in schools opening through the first part of 2021, we're asking for a delay to the addition of the new patrol personnel until next summer, which subsequently reduces the 2021 portion of the budget.
By how much?
It depends on when we start, but it's about...
It's approximately 210,000, was it, Mike?
And all I would say is that we have the ability to send that letter to the county to ask for those, to start paying for those bodies. And depending on COVID and when the schools start, we can adjust. And again, always, with in the best interest of the city, our staffing, and also of the budget.
All right, Chief, thank you very much. And the chief will be here to answer any other questions down the road. I want you to know that I've got Director Anjali and Public Works Director Jeff from Public Works to answer any other questions later on this evening. I wanted to mention that some of the council members had some questions about some other personnel adjustments, and so I'll just make mention of those. Many other questions may come, but I've shifted some personnel around from a few areas where I found there to be necessary alternative opportunities and to be responsive to the current staffing needs and to address current issues. A couple of the positions, to help you understand my thoughts, Tammy over in the clerk's office had been an LTE, a limited term employee, for nearly 2 years. And early on this year, I had to give consideration to releasing that her position because I couldn't see the need for it. But the staff had come to me and provided me the background of what Tammy had been working on in a records management system that was lingering because of the turnover in the city manager's office. And so after I sat down, went over all of that, I had Tammy continue to work on that. And we've stayed with that program now, and we'll have it complete. She completed the research, and now it's turned over to IT, where we have now another limited term employee who will see through the contractor for all of the technical items. And Tammy will continue to work in the clerk's office, helping us get caught up, helping us with our PRRs, and is slowly working on attaining more classes to help with her clerk duties. We anticipate that the records management system will be up in about a year, at which time they will transition back over to Tammy's supervision of that. And once it's up and running, in approximately 2 years, we will have significant assistance with our PRRs, hoping it will cut down on the amount of time and effort taken to address those issues. And we are sorely behind and need to put our records into a proper filing system. So we really look forward to getting that accomplished. In addition, we've added a limited term employee in our communications area. We had the need for further support and effort in the communications area, and we had not had good luck with contracting with a couple of different folks. So we found this to actually be more cost effective right now and an effective way for us to proceed at the current time. But again, it's a limited term employee. The management analyst is added to assist us in the coordination of a number of functions that's been spread out throughout the organization. You may or may not recall we had a director of administrative services that left the organization a couple of years ago. And management at the time thought that we should focus on an HR person. And as we pursued that, that person came here, was here a few weeks, and then left. But the position has been left vacant for nearly all of that time. And as a part of doing that, positions that were under the purview of that department needed supervision, and they needed to be accomplished, but they were dispersed around the organization. When I was here as interim and getting familiar with the organization, I saw that, was prepared to address to the council that it needed to be taken care of. But upon my appointment, it's now incumbent upon me to remedy this problem. And it poses areas of significant risk. The incidents have been low, but we need to get these positions realigned and back under a director's position. And this is areas of risk management, safety, workers' comp, monitoring, along with personnel, HR, contract management, and more support to our human services, of which this position will give some support. I'm completing an analysis and waiting a report from management partners to help review some of the recommendations I was going to make. And their initial report verbally to me is very supportive of what our efforts are here to bring these back under the supervision of a key leadership director person in the organization, and I expect that report very soon. Let's move on now to discuss the bank capacity, so we can go back over that. The budget proposes the use of bank capacity of property taxes that the council has not taken for 11 years, plus the 1%. As I said earlier, I feel a duty to recommend that this be done here because there's such a gap, structural deficit, that looking at available revenues is a ready option. It's not the complete solution, but is one that is easily enacted. I'm recommending this because of the structural deficit, and I must point out to the council and address this in, I think, what is a fiscally prudent manner. Whereas I understand many will say use reserves as they are way too high, that's a policy decision that the council may certainly entertain and decide to do. But that is not what this manager would recommend as the only solution, because operational costs should not be sustained from a savings account. The City Council can ask, what additional monies can you cut, Mr. Manager? And as the chief pointed out, we have the officers that we could delay on funding for them. And there are a few other positions in the organization, such as the management analyst, and that could save us approximately, I think, Mike, we had a slide there of about 380,000 or so. 381. So that's from fully funded positions that were delayed approximately 6 months. But I wanted to point out that the bank capacity that I'm recommending, while onerous, 11 years, not taking it, those are political decisions and policy decisions the council has to make. What I wanted to point out that it is, we bounced around from $145 a year up to $195 per year for a $900,000 assessed valuation home. I think we're currently looking at about $153 per year. That's about $12.75 a month, $2.94 a week, or approximately 42 cents a day. It's not a significant impact in any measure. The $400,000 or just less than $400,000 that we could impose some cuts and delays in hiring some personnel. If we use a $400,000 figure, if you figure that there's $104.8 million of expenditures in this budget, that amounts to approximately 0.38% of the recommended expenditures. Again, I do have to ask the question, is the pain worth the cut? As you'll see when we get to the stripped down version of the budget, we're looking at approximately $16.6 million. That $400,000 is approximately 2.4% of the deficit problem. So again, we need to ask ourselves, is it worth the pain of the delayed staffing? From a principled standpoint, a policy standpoint, that's a question for the council. So we've gone through a lot of the slides I have. Let's move on to how the budget transfers show, and I'll ask you to take us through this, Aaron.
Okay, so the slide that's showing now should be just focusing in on the operating picture. So we're just looking at operating revenues, operating expense, and then the difference over the 2-year period of 21-22 showing 16.6 million. What's included in this slide, this illustration, is in 2022, there is a transfer, operating expenses, that's going from the general fund to the General Facilities Capital Fund, number 301, for those tracking the fund numbers. And that transfer is related to the fire station renovations. So this depiction of that difference is illustrating if that transfer is treated as an operating expense. So the reason I'm pointing that out is, next slide, if you take out that 3.4 million transfer out of the operating expense line, then the difference over the period from 21-22 goes down to 13.2 million. And then it still shows you the representative example of if the 1% property tax increase and bank capacity are still utilized, the difference after that goes down to 7.5 million. So that's the illustration of just how we're treating that transfer and whether that is shown as an operating expense, or if you take it out of the operating expense, this would be your net structural operations gap.
Okay, thank you. We wanted to point this out so that we could strip it all back. That way the council has a more clean and clear picture of what the structural problem is, and that you could decide to spend reserves addressing that for another 2-year period, because it is your balance is significantly greater than your emergency reserve. Or you may want to use a combination of addressing some increase in bank capacity, or address all of your bank capacity as well as your 1% that you're allowed to take to fill that gap that exists. And we've shown you where that bank capacity is and how it's built. One of the questions that I was asked was, what would be the impact if we had taken the 1% over the last several years, each year for the last 11 years? And it would make a difference, I assume, just in general numbers, a compounding impact of about $13 million that the council would have. They would either have it in their reserves, or presumably you might have spent it to fill what has been an operational deficit to help cover that, and use less reserves because you would have had some cash flow to cover it. We don't have a slide to that effect. It was just numbers that we ran this afternoon, and I wanted to recall that as best I could. We have another slide to show you on the other utility tax is out there as an option. It's just another option the council has. And Aaron, you can show us through this one on some of the assumptions that we made.
Sure. So this is actually an updated estimate based on new data that we pulled in from the Association of Washington Cities. They do a tax survey, as well as some of our east side cities, our comparable cities, went right to get their 2019 data with specific regard to their utility taxes that they're collecting. So we updated the example and also the 1% levy estimate. So this is an updated estimate of if we were to levy all utilities except water, sewer, and stormwater, so excluding those 3 utilities, but it's in effect would be on the other utilities such as gas, electric, phone, garbage, and cable, the 1% would be estimated to collect 1.3 million per 1%. So that's the updated estimate that we have. And then the illustration there breaks it down for a household and just looks at a sample household. If the household paid $417 per month on gas, electric, phone, garbage, and cable, then the 1% utility tax on those would equate to $50 per year for that household. There's also some debt illustration information. Again, that's just a reminder of a scenario that we ran for a 20-year bond issue back in June. That was the June interest rate of 1.94%. So, of course, your actual bond interest rate is going to be dependent on when the bond is issued itself. But that just gave an example in order to get a ballpark of what the debt service payment requirements would be, and that equated to around a $1.25 million per year for a $20 million GO bond.
All right, Aaron, thank you very much. So once again, I want to emphasize that this is where the council can certainly invoke their policy determinations to guide us, give us some direction that we can discuss then as we open the public hearing tomorrow on issues that might guide us in using the reserves and or invoking your councilmatic powers to do a property tax increase and or consider a utility increase. Because not everything gets covered at one time, I want to remind the council we have a very, you have reminded me, some of you, that we have a very limited capital program for the next 2 years. But there are a number of capital projects out there that we will be reevaluating as we reassess most all of them in Public Works over the course of the next several months in the spring up to approaching mid-year next year. There are also some projects in parks that we may take into consideration. There are some opportunities out there that council has looked at in the past of acquiring more parkland. I just remind the council in acquiring parkland, you should always be prudent and put money away for the maintenance of that parkland. But these capital projects that you want to take on, you need to have the money to do that. And if you use all of your reserves, remember, you'll have less money to spend on capital projects that we will be revisiting, and the council will have an opportunity to decide on which projects to move forward with as we try to work on our TIP this next year. Aaron, do we have any other?
Yeah, I just would add kind of to put some numbers to the reserve comments there so we can go to the slide on the operating reserve. So from the operations standpoint, we had an ending fund balance at the end of 2020 that was reflecting $22.4 million. That's after the 10% strategic reserve has been taken out of $4.9 million. So that's what's currently shown in the city manager's budget as available unrestricted projected ending fund balance. So that's after the 2-year period. So that's the end of 2022.
Right. And we will be ending the year in the black. We will have salary savings. We will have some projects that have not been completed. We will have some contracts that haven't been expended. That is normal. We don't know exactly what that will be yet, but we'll be closing in on it. So I think I'm hopeful that with that information, you have a little more insight to what we're looking at. And as we asked you to think about before, next slide, there were some decisions that I was seeking your guidance on, and I heard from some council members at our last study session on expenses to sustain, reduce, or increase other existing service levels and or associated funding, on revenues to affirm or adjust the proposed bank capacity and annual allowable 1% tax levy increase. I'm not asking you to take a vote or anything like that this evening, but to have some dialogue. I'm sure you can do that with all the council members present tomorrow as we open up the public hearing on this process. And then our reserves, to think about the amount and type of reserve adjustments are dependent upon the consensus and direction that that occurs with number 1 and number 2 above. And I think with that, I'd like to turn it back over to the deputy mayor. Thank you.
Council, in order to attempt to make this as smooth as possible, I want to make sure that we maybe ask a pair of questions and then move to the next council member. We can always circle back, but that way all of us are able to ask a few questions and then move on to the next. I realize we have a very long matrix. Hopefully your questions were answered, but if there are steps in the matrix that was not answered or you want to further drill down on, now is a good time for that. So I am looking in the chat box. It looks like Councilmember Ross. Go ahead.
We're jumping in the I'm getting echoes. Oh my, hang on. Why don't you skip to someone else? I'll try to get out.
Okay. I'm trying to get back into the chat. I don't have anybody else in the chat.
I'm
just going to have. Okay.
Go ahead.
Councilmember Stewart, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Deputy Mayor.
No, I have Jason sitting in there. Councilmember Ritchie?
Thank you, guys. I'll try to make my overarching question, I guess, was I want to kind of wait to hear the conversation tomorrow on some of the other things, but focusing on questions rather than comments. I'm concerned about the idea of there being. I appreciate the amendments that were made, City Manager. I very much do. I think you clearly read through the matrix and addressed a lot of the questions that were there. My big concern is the capital expenses that we don't necessarily know what we're going to be dealing with, and we've kind of just put some money out there. I had a pretty good conversation, I think, with Councilmember Ross about the idea of taking, I guess the best way I'll say is taxpayer dollars in the form of increased property taxes and putting those towards essentially operating expenses. I'm not entirely sure that's the best move. I don't know. I'm concerned about that. I'm kind of concerned about how we're going about figuring out how we spend what money. And I'll be specific about that in as much as, are we focusing in on trying to utilize our bond capacity for those long-term infrastructure / capital expenses and not our bank capacity? Meaning, are we focusing in on utilizing our bonds for those long-term projects, which over time hopefully will pay for themselves? And how does that look versus hiring more people at a time where we have a lot of unsureness, just a lot of variables going on with the economy and property values and jobs and things like that. I'm just trying to make sure we're focusing on spending the money that we have in a way that is frankly reasonable and sustainable long term. For example, if we go ahead and take our full bank capacity and we do take our overage or our additional $20 some odd million, whatever it is, and put that towards some of these capital projects and these staff upgrades or filling some positions, that doesn't leave us with a lot of room to move. I guess that's my takeaway from the whole thing. So I guess I'm hoping that there's some flexibility built in, but I'm hoping you can speak to that. And I'll just leave it there.
All right, thank you, Councilman. No, there is no contemplation in what I've proposed to use any sort of bonding or anything. We've just shown it on there. It was on the slide. It's something that the council can think about that's out there, but I have no recommendation of that at all. I think the council would need to do a lot of study on what types of projects, what kind of expenditures, how long it might take, a whole set of different parameters, because then you need the cash flow to do that, unless you're going to use additional bond capacity to make your cash flow. And I don't think that's necessarily the best alternative, giving it's just not the best alternative out there. You should always try to do that based on cash flow. The bank capacity is also based on a cash flow. It's making sure that your operational expenditures, absent capital, and we have sort of a mixed bag here on our operational side. It's just the way some of the bars programming is and options that you have here in Washington. But we want to, I think it's prudent to make sure that you have cash flow to cover your operational expenditures. When it comes to capital that is one-time expenditure for repairs that are significant, for reconstructing streets, for building new intersections, building new buildings, that sort of thing, those are capital, and you can certainly use your reserves. That's why you have them. That's why you build them up, so that you can acquire property, you can do construction, and you can take care of major investments. But on an operational basis, that's what I think you need to have in cash flow, and I believe you have an insufficient cash flow to cover your ongoing expenses, and that's why I look to your bank capacity. It's also something that a council member or two has said, well, you know, a possibility is looking at the utility tax and putting a sunset clause on it. I can understand the prudence with which the council is approaching additional cost on their citizenry. It's a very prudent, it's a very important element to take into consideration. But when I was reviewing two financial studies of two communities here in King County with the city managers group this last week, Sammamish is listed in the lower 25%. That is the lower quartile of per capita, revenue per capita in the county of King County. You have no utility tax, and property taxes are relatively low compared to those other communities. And you have a community here that can absorb it. And as I pointed out, it's not a very significant amount on a property basis. And that's why I prudently put that forward, is that you need to have cash flow, and you should not be spending your savings account to cover your operational expenses. And your operational expenditures have been growing. It's not all growing in this biennial budget. It has been growing, and it needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Councilmember Ross, are you back on?
Yeah, how do I sound now?
You sound fine.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I think the city manager and I philosophically have the same philosophy. In particular, it's isolating what constitutes one-time operating expenses and what constitutes recurring operating expense. When you looked at the chart 10 that he presented, we have, when you take out transfers, we have a cash flow, using the term cash flow, real revenues that are less than expenses by $16.6 million. And then he said, okay, well, how do we close that? That's a structural deficit, meaning we have to every year bridge that difference. Otherwise, we're going to draw on fund balances. And the fund balances are only at $22.4 million, and those eventually will be exhausted. Plus, we'd like to use a lot of those funds for some of our stormwater and CIP projects and so on, and retain the 10% as much as possible. We want to have our operating fund funding itself with revenues, and expenses don't exceed revenues. Now, when he started with $16.6 million, he suggested, okay, how do we close that gap? Well, most of it is a recurring deficit. Part of it is a one-time expenditure, and I would acknowledge the fire house design for the $3-some million is a one-time expenditure. We wouldn't want to raise taxes or close that gap on a recurring basis because it's just going to be in that biennium, and we won't have to do design in the future and so on. So that, in that case, that may be a consideration for a one-time fund balance transfer. Close that. The bank capacity is a permanent recurring source of revenue. And so after you took out the $3-some million from the $16.6 million deficit, we have $13 million to close. 5.7 of that is closed by bank capacity in the proposal from the city manager, and we got to figure out the rest, whether it be either moving forward with drawing some fund balances for recurring expenditures or reducing our expenditures. I'd like to really give kudos to our finance team. Aaron and Chris, I drive them nuts. They probably, them and their teams are the smartest people in this region. We get repeat awards on a national level for excellence in financial reporting. The city should be very, very blessed that they're serving our city. Where I lose Aaron is he's too smart sometimes. And that's where he loses some of us. And that's where I had to, with my 36 years of financial experience, spend some time to claw back my understanding of this. And so, like, for example, when we shifted to Chart 11, it showed a $7.5 million after you take out the $3.4 million of fire design, it leaves 7.5. Well, that $3-some is something the council has to decide on, a funding source, and that would have been a fund balance, not a tax source. So we need to be very transparent and maybe start with Chart 10 where it's laid it out where, okay, bank capacity closes 5.7, leaving us $10.9 million to work. Then what do we do? Oh, let's take $3.4 million from the 10.9 and use the fund balance to fund that. That leaves us with 7.5 more to work. We just need to iteratively go down that deficit of $16.6 million and be very transparent in our reporting. Aaron obviously knows what's going on, but not everybody sees that transition from chart to chart to chart and where we go from a cash flow to how we close it, drawing on a combination of fund balances and tax sources. So I want to be very clear. One, applaud the finance team. Two, I think our city manager is spot on his approach. Don't fund one-time expenditures with recurring revenues, and close the structural gap on recurring expenses with revenues as necessary. Let's see what else I want to say. As far as lower quartile of our spending, it always makes me cringe because there's a reason why we're in the lower quartile. For example, if you have a lot of retail and retail sales, you draw more public safety issues. So when you increase your sales tax base, correspondingly you increase your expenses in public safety expenditures to accompany it. So it's not easy to compare apples to apples in doing those metrics on the cost or revenue per capita. And many of those costs are fixed and don't dramatically increase or decrease based on population. So we got to be very careful we don't get overly enamored by those metrics and not think that maybe our goal is to bring us up into the middle upper quartile. I think we'll always be in the lower quartile if our structural shape is the way it is now. We're going to be somewhere in the lower quartile, but not climb dramatically from a cost purpose. But we need to make sure that we're serving our city, providing the services they need, the public safety they need, and then we'll get into the CIP, make sure that there's adequate infrastructure for our city to make it a great place to live. So it all goes hand in hand. So I just wanted to cover some of those points and comments on the budget. We have a $16.6 million gap structurally for operations, and it's to figure out between fund balances and tax revenues or reduction of expenses, how to close that. That's what the council needs to do in the near term. We need to obviously work on the long-term capital improvement plan, but we need to focus on the operating plan today and close the $6.6 million.
Great. Councilmember Stewart.
Sure. A couple of things. I'm still struggling. Dave, we spoke last week, and I had asked, and I know Councilmember Ross had asked as well. I think it's really hard for us to understand. So I'm going to focus right now just on the expenses side. It's really hard to know if you want to go back to where you're comparing the budgeted expenses, because you touched on it in that historically, we have always come up under budget in terms of our expenses. So to say that our expenses have increased by, I think, what'd you say, 3.7 from budgeted to budgeted, I'm not sure that, I mean, that may be accurate, but I think that this budget proposes a much larger increase in expenses when you compare it from actuals to budgeted. And that's where I would like to be able to understand that more, so that we can figure out if there are places where we can close that gap. So that's one thing that I'd like to understand is where does the budget, and you're just showing us 2021, the 2022 budget goes up another $3.8 million in expenses. And so it's not, and as we talked about, I had a lot of detailed questions, but some of my very early asks in the matrix were, can we get that sort of high level, you know, it's because we've added 3 people, we're adding this, we're adding that. That's where these additions are coming from. So I still don't feel like I have a really good understanding of that. When you look at right now, we have currently about 17 vacancies. And then you're also talking about adding more personnel on top of that. You're saying, you know, we're only going to add a couple of people in 2021, but you're adding a couple of people to the budgeted number of people we have. So in your budget, have you considered that we're not going to hire all of these people on day one? Are you assuming that they'll come in March and June and September, or are you assuming all of them are there on day one?
The city has traditionally budgeted from day one.
Okay.
And that's what.
So I feel like some of the, sorry, go ahead.
And that's what we have done here, with the exception of what I just ponied up, if the council wants to take it, the $381,000 of deferral on some of the new positions. On the existing positions, no, I haven't. I mean, it factors in, you end up with a surplus at the end of the year, but that's the way most municipalities budget. And in particular, I wanted to point out that this city traditionally, with that $300,000 capacity, or $3 million in contingency, although we've used it this year, it still could have a couple $1 million in there. By over budgeting way beyond your operational expenditures, you coincide that with identifying revenues and or using reserves to have a balanced budget. So when you continue to do that, you continue to have larger year-end balances. And what it doesn't show you, excuse me, let me finish, please. And what it doesn't reveal to you is when you have increasing operational costs in departments, it's masked. And that's what I'm trying to do, is bring that forward and showing that there has been an incurring and growing cost of operations in your departments. And though a lot of it looks like it's happening in this biennial budget, it's been growing. That's all. Not hiding anything.
Not implying that you're hiding. I'm just saying that if we're going to take a historic increase in taxes, I feel like the budget number, the expense number we should be working with is a little bit more real, especially considering the fact that we are most likely going to continue to be in a lockdown state for at least half, if not much, of 2021. So and we talked about this as well, is how are we adjusting our expenses in the first part of 2021, assuming we're still in the lockdown state? So if I can get some clarification, it sounded like we have some delays in the police because we know that, schools are probably not going to be open physically, at least not this year, and probably not the first part of next year. And I'm just trying to, you said a lot of numbers and we don't have this anywhere in writing. How much was that we might be able to say? Was it 210,000? Is that correct?
Yeah, that was correct. That was part of that $381,000. And because we would have the we funded the SROs. The SROs help us with our patrol and redeployment. So that's why we can delay. We're gambling, I think, pretty low risk on the fact that schools are going to be delayed in opening. I would agree with you there. That's why I've discussed with the chief that we can delay approximately 6 months. I don't believe we should delay longer than that because we don't have a vision into what's going to happen in the fall, and we're already short-staffed, and to me, it's not worth the risk.
That's fine. It's okay. It was a yes or no answer. So it's 210,000. So we'll have 210,000 that we can save because we don't need our SROs in closed school buildings. There was also a comment made before that for new officers that we bring on, that it's 9 months. We start paying for them for 9 months before their boots on the ground because they're entry level. What if we brought someone on who wasn't entry level, so we're not paying for 9 months of not having officers here? Do we know what those numbers look like?
Well, I think that is a very realistic and logical question for which there's an illogical answer, and it doesn't make a difference whether it's a lateral or a new boot, and the chief can explain that. It's just the way the Sheriff's Department works and is funded. We've already looked at that. I've talked to him about it. But Chief, do you have any more to offer?
Just that the agreement and the interlocal agreement between the cities and the Sheriff's Office is that it can take up to 9 months to hire and train a new officer to be on their own. And so when we add a new officer, that is taken into account. We begin paying, and then it can be up to 9 months before we see that body. Now, and again, especially if you look at it now, depending on available personnel, if the county is able to hire more bodies, if, for example, the county were to cut and more bodies become available that are already working, that can change and we can hire sooner than later. But that's just an agreement between all the cities and the county in the interlocal that puts a standard of 9 months. When you actually look at recruiting, testing, background, and training, it's actually much more than that.
Okay. And then I know, Deputy Mayor, I will cede my turn and wait for the next round. But I also noticed that in the budget, we do have things that feel like they are capital and not operations. So we have some of the refurbishment of some of the firehouses. I saw vehicles in there. Why are those operations, buying new vehicles, and not part of capital?
So the operations budget, if it's classified as a capital within the operating budget, so for example, the general fund, a piece of equipment that's bought, that's a capital purchase, is in the general fund, because that's who's operating it, that's how the accounting for it works, versus a fire station that would be under general facilities capital, that's where it's built out of. So it's the 301 fund that signifies the accounting of being a capital cost. So that's kind of difference that the accounting structure comes up with on what things should be classified for the capital and what things are classified as operating. There is some further complexities that deal with specifically the pavement management program and what gets split on operations and maintenance for a road and included into street fund, for example, versus a capital road project that's a complete brand new road that's being built that's paid out of the capital fund number 340, transportation capital fund. So we're following the BAR's requirements on those, on what can be included in each of those funds, both on the operating side and the capital side. But yes, it's acknowledged that there are some capital costs, small capital costs that are included in the operating funds, and that will always be the case, I think.
Okay. Thanks, Aaron. I appreciate that. I guess my overarching concern is just that we're budgeting for, and I don't know, how many people are we adding in 2020 over the 2019, or 2021 over the 2020 number of FTEs?
3. You have a new attorney, a paralegal, a management analyst, and in year 2022, a mechanic.
Okay. So it's +3 in 2021 and +1 in 2022?
Yes, and some of those costs are offset by reductions in contracts. Over in legal, we looked at the salary and benefits are certainly greater than the contractual amount that we're paying now, but we reduced our forward thinking on some of the litigation costs, and we've looked internally at hearing officer expenses will go down, and some of the other things that were in the contracted amounts, so that we hopefully will spend the next year reducing some more areas there. But it was too much of an unknown to dive right in there and make a significant whack at it. But we tried to prevent, I think we cut back at least a couple $100,000 in litigation rather than doing an inflator and just inflating it and trying to push that forward on you.
Yeah, so we've got 17.5 vacancies right now, +3, +1. So I'm not suggesting we use the term hiring freeze, but I am suggesting that given the state of affairs of the world, we are going to continue in some form of suspended animation well into 2021. And so I don't know that we should be increasing our staff by 20.5 people in 2021 from where we are today. And that's just a conversation that we haven't had of exactly where those people are going to be going, and do we really need them for the entirety of 2021. I appreciate that they provide some amount of cushion, but if the reality is we don't really need them in 2021 at all, or we don't need them until the fall of 2021, I don't want to be assuming those expenses and raising taxes to cover an expense that we know we're not going to be incurring. And so I just don't feel like we have that level of transparency to be making these kinds of decisions yet. So that's kind of what I'm feeling is just basically we need to be comparing the 2021 and 2022 budgets to the actuals of 19 and 20. We know almost the entirety of 20, and we certainly know the actuals of 19, and not comparing them to the budgeted because we know we came in under budget. So I think the increase in expenses is much higher in this budget cycle than it was to our actuals, and I think we need to get a handle on what those increases are before we make decisions on raising taxes. Thanks.
Thanks, Councilmember Stewart. I likewise have some questions, or at least want to express kind of some of my concerns or subject matter to which, this council has not had an opportunity to really have a discussion on. So that's why adding this meeting this week, I think, was nice just for us to have an opportunity to talk and hear from one another. First I wanted to say thanks to staff and our city manager for putting this together. It's a huge lift to to the biennial budget. We know that, and it's likewise, it's a big lift for council because we have to kind of, get into the numbers that you guys have been working with for a while. And sometimes it can take us a while to unpack that and ask questions so that we understand it. So appreciate your patience with us as we work through that. I think a lot of kind of my concerns and sentiments have been expressed, and that is relative to making sure that our operating expenses have a matching revenue source. And right now we don't have that, which then starts to dwindle down our reserves, and long term, that's not viable. So, I think the management analyst, I guess, gives me a little bit of heartburn in the budget, and I'm wondering if that is maybe a source to cut some of those operating expenses. Mr. City Manager, maybe you can speak to where they would be utilized and in what capacity. I mean, I do want to recognize that our citizens do hold the city to a pretty high standard. And, council is not outside of that. As part of the citizenry, we, hold staff to a high standard as well. And everyone has expectations that, the city is running smoothly. And that, of course, translates into money. So, I think it's kind of matching our community's expectations, and whether that is in the form of, when they dial 911, how fast police are able to respond to, other issues like turfing our athletic fields. There's a relative balance, and I do admit that taking the full 11% of big capacity gives me some heartburn, although I do understand that the purpose of it is to kind of find that revenue source for operations. I think the part that gives me heartburn right now is the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic when everything is retracting, and for us to be expanding in this regard doesn't quite match the sentiment that's kind of going on out there, and I want to reconcile that against the full council's sentiment. But I do again recognize, and I'm the first to admit, the last 2 years I have voted to take at least the 1%, and that has not been something we've done. So I recognize bank capacity as being a source for kind of filling that gap. But as Councilmember Ross stated, there's still a $6+ million gap that we have to figure out. And I don't expect us to figure it all out because we do have reserves to lean on. But again, long term, that's not viable, and we do need to find revenue sources, or we need to make cuts somewhere. And so before we go and add, and that's why I think that management analyst position in particular makes me wonder whether or not that one is maybe something we consider not putting on our budget. And then if we're looking for other ways to, it's not closing that operational side of things, but on the capital side, as we go and dwindle down our operational, our reserves, is, we've got a field turf replacement at $6.4 million. We've got athletic fields at $5 million. And, we just saw an email today that said the Lake Washington School District isn't planning to utilize their community fields at all. And so, if we're trying to kind of pull back a little bit, at least in the middle of the pandemic, then, those are things we might look at as well. So let's see, I think we've got round two going. Let me pop over here.
Deputy Mayor, if I could answer your question on the management analyst while you're looking. All right. You have a function in the city that is called risk management. Risk management has been reduced to an employee who tracks and gathers the information on auto accidents, make sure whether it's a city accident or it's, whoops, somebody's mic is open. or whether it's an accident where somebody's run into a tree trunk that's stuck out on Sahali Way. They gather that information and they get it to our insurance carrier, and our insurance carrier helps us with a number of those things. But risk management hasn't really been attended to for a couple of years. That's a high risk, low incident example. We have no safety program in this city for our folks. They do their tailgate programs and maintenance, but we have no other safety program for all the rest of our employees. We don't really have anyone who's monitoring workers' comp. Again, high risk, low incident. We've been lucky. Human Services has expressed to me for several months that they need some support. When the Administrative Services Director position went away, as I referred to earlier, contracts were fed out to another area, to an employee that, anyway, they've been sent to different areas of the organization, clerk's office, somebody else over in Parks is handling it, and there isn't a central area for that. For legal contracts, because community service or community development dealt with the attorneys a little bit more, that's where legal contracts have gone. And they have managed to coordinate those bills for payment. Nobody's reviewing them. Nobody's looking them at outside attorneys and reviewing all of that stuff, coordinating where dollars can be saved. I'm hoping that, well, I know that we bring in legal services, the paralegal will help do that. But that's the kind of thing that's going on. Those are the types of things that have been neglected, and that's why we need another budget analyst. It's just not something that, oh, we think they can help out here and maybe they can help out there. We need somebody in that position who can work under that director and help get those things covered. Somebody who knows how to push numbers, somebody who knows how to do analytical work. It's a vacancy that's long overdue in this city. However, it's part of the 381. I can put it off for 6 months, but I'd be negligent if I didn't try to push to fill that position. So I appreciate you bringing it up and giving me the opportunity to address it.
So, Council, I know I've got Chris and PM in the chat wanting to go, but I wondered, if you guys just want to go through another round here, knowing that there might be more questions. Jason, you weren't in that queue. Do you want to pass?
Well, I didn't realize. I thought we were going in circles. I do have a question.
We are.
But I'll go. I can go with. I can go at
yep,
the end. Whatever.
Go ahead.
Right on. Relative to what is, I guess I'm going to pause here, and I don't want to soapbox or commentary. I'm concerned that we're kind of taking a big jump here in changing things. Dave, I don't disagree with the management analysts. Christy, I don't disagree with the turf overlays. I think we're saying a lot of this. There's a lot of important things in the budget that we're discussing here, and I'm grateful that we've got people that are following it. I agree with Councilman Ross that we have, great staff and great finance folks, and it's an informative thing. My concern is timing, and is there a way that we can take a look at this on we don't have all the information we're going to have 6 months from now, relative to, everything. I'm thinking. The police relative to the town center, the schools relative to police, the rainy season relative to roads, to turf in the fields that are being underutilized. There's a lot of information that, as Councilmember Stewart said, we're kind of in the midst of this. We don't really know what to expect, right, in terms of how these things are happening. Having said that, there are some things that we do know that we need. And I guess in my mind, I guess there's a point where we can look at this as a holistic, overarching. Let's make a turn here and approve a bunch of things, and that's what the city managers propose. And I'm very grateful that you've done that. I've learned a lot. I didn't realize there were as many gaps in our processes and our budgets, and that's what the budget is. It's kind of an invasive process, and you figure out where you stand and what you need. It's been helpful to me to understand, just from city council member perspective, to better understand where we should be spending our time, and that's there. But timing-wise, is there a way that we could see something from a budget that buys us some time so that we can get more well-informed about what will be happening 6 months from now? I'm optimistic that 6 months from now, maybe 8 months from now, there will be more information that will allow us to utilize the mid-biennial budget review process to be able to make some more well-informed decisions. That's where my mind goes in this process. And that this has been so informative, I think it leads to more questions that we need to kind of seek answers to, and more 2s and 3s, and more review of how things are going with the current staff and the labor organizing component. I mean, there's a lot of things that are kind of coming to fruition all at once in the midst of a pandemic, right? So it's kind of a really challenging thing to try to figure out, how do we spend our money? And I'm hopeful that maybe you can put together, I mentioned maybe a plan B, or just a status quo budget with some changes, or with some minor changes, some emergency tweaks, and then make these major changes, because it is a significant departure in a good way. I'm not questioning veracity. I'm not challenging the need. I'm saying that we need to review these in a more long-term view with more information. And I'm hoping you can plug in some numbers that would be, over the next 6 months or 8 months, I need X, Y, and Z. And let's fill in A through X, or A through whatever, A through W for the next 8 months. Let's get those questions answered, and let's figure those things out. I don't know if that's feasible, but that would be my ask in terms of kind of really narrowing down what we're trying to do in this short term up against the statutory. We have to make some decisions. I think Aaron said regarding notifications, if we are going to take the property tax increase to 1%, if we are going to go do that, down that path, we do have to make some decisions relatively quickly. And I'd like to know if we can do those things a little bit more farther down the road, not under the gun, and maybe get focused on what's essential at the moment, and then as more information comes in, make some more decisions. I can't hear anybody if somebody's talking.
Everybody was kind of looking at each other going, council could direct
I think
us.
Christy's just having some issue with the sound.
No?
I think she's frozen.
Our sound is good.
Oh, yeah.
Dave, I'm not asking you to pull a rabbit out of a hat here. I appreciate everything you've done. I want to say that again. I'm not trying to challenge anything. I'm not questioning veracity. All I'm asking is to try to maybe pull it back a notch. And I don't know if there's consensus on that or not. But, sorry. I can hear you, Christy. It's Jason.
Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, a little bit.
We can hear you.
Crackly.
Yep.
Those are always options for the council to give us directives to go back and unfund or not expand or cut projects. So we're just the working folk. You just give us the direction.
Deputy Mayor, are you there?
I am. I'm trying to log in on a
There we
different device. So, yes, but Councilmember Ross, I think he's up. So, now he's on mute.
All right, I'm just going to go over there.
I thought I saw Councilman Stewart.
Oh, you got the bad echo again, Councilmember.
Yeah, I think that was me as I was clicking on one meeting.
If you dial in two devices, you cause that, yeah. Okay. Whoever's next, I thought
Councilmember Ross, it's you. If we go in around, it's you.
Oh, okay. Okay, very good. I wanted to first understand the $22.4 million operating fund balance after reserving for the 10%. What assumption is that underlying number? Does that include taking $5.7 million banked capacity and closing the rest of the $10.9 million. What does that assume?
Yes, that assumes the bank, it assumes what was included in the city manager's budget, which is using 3.4 million of that for the fire capital, and it also includes the bank capacity and the 1% for both years, for 2021 and 2022.
And the rest of the 10.9 million as well is funded effectively in this ending balance. The reason I ask, yeah, go ahead and answer that question. Is
yes.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, if I were to go back to the slide 10 skeleton, which is has 16.6 million before these decisions, is it fair to say that 22.4 million reserve balance, if we had no decisions funded it, well, if we took out the bank capacity and the 10.9 million funded by whatever's remaining, you would add 16.6 million minus the 22.4. So really, we only have about 6 million before we make council decisions. Is that right? Because you have to add. You're assuming your revenue of 5.7 million is taken in the budget, so you effectively, that influences the fund balance positively, ending balance positively. So 22.4, you have to add back the 5, or subtract the 5.7 because that would take that out. That leaves you 16.6 ending fund balance. Is there any other budget assumptions from the city manager's report that would make that even reduced further? Do you track where I'm saying? You at least took the bank capacity in the city manager's budget, which makes the 22.5 higher than it should be if you didn't have the bank capacity. So you really are 22.4 minus 5.7. That leaves you at 16.7 ending balance. And is there any other parts? And I think you balanced the budget, which means you drew fund the remaining amount of the 16.6 likely would further reduce the fund balance.
So,
or actually,
so I was following for the first part where you were talking about the 22 million.
Yeah, first part. So I'm trying to figure out the rest. Normalize it. Just normalize it for me. What is the balance if the city manager put forward a budget with the 16.6 structural deficit? What is the ending balance after 10%? In other words, normalize or change the 22.4. Help me come up with that number so we all know how much fund balance, our starting point of the fund balance is. And so we may be drawing from funds to pay for some of this gap or tax increases to pay for some of the gap. But what's the fund balance adjusted for the city managers? If we adjusted his report to 16.6. 22.4 assumes you've closed the gap by tax increases and fund draws. That's true.
Yeah, so it would be 22.4, the fund balance at the end of 2022, less the 5.7 right. If you didn't take the 1% in the bank capacity.
Okay.
So that's what the unrestricted portion would be for general fund ending fund balance at the end of 2022.
So if we didn't increase taxes, I guess what I'm driving at, or reduce costs the way it's now structurally, we're going to use up our fund balance entirely this biennium for operations. Because you said that if you took out the 5.7, you have 16.7 left in the fund balance. And we have a 16.6 gap to make up with taxes or funds. And if you didn't take taxes, you're going to have to draw on that fund balance, and that wipes it out, right?
Well, you're kind of mixing different illustrations. So the 22.4 ending fund balance is already assuming the 3.4 million of operating expense transfer going out. So that's already baked into the 22.4. And then, so if you start with the 22.4 and you take out the tax increase, just the 1% in the bank capacity, you get to 16.7 million of fund balance. So that fund balance is over and above what would already be funded through the 21-22 period. What's already funded in the 21-22 period is the pavement overlay program of 3.2 million per year. So you have another 6.4 million there that's funded one time through that period that's in that, when you're just looking at that one particular fund amount. So it's kind of a little bit of a mix there in the illustration.
Yeah, I don't want to add levels of confusion because I'm actually tracking you, but I think pursuing it further might confuse. But the bottom line is we'll have to align our ending fund balance with a 16.6 structural scenario and whatever that is. The other point is I wanted to talk a little bit about moving headcount between departments that were previously approved in the budget. And we, as a council member, were approving priorities for each department, and each department pitches a justification for why that head is needed for that department, and the council nods yes or no. And we approved a significant number of heads last biennium because they justified it for the purpose that they were presented to the council. Then to later say, oh, let's mix and match headcount. We're not approving a lump sum overhead amount. We're not approving the lump sum headcount. We're approving these positions for these departments because the city manager and their staff demonstrated a priority. So with that said, I was somewhat surprised of that, the mix and matching going on, because I mean we can call into question, but I think there needs to be a process where if we're going to change what we approve by department, I think there has to be a go back and a justification by the city manager of the council. Say, hey, council, you approved in the biennium budget for the planning department, but we want to use it for IT department, and this is why. We very well may say, yeah, that's great, but just simply to move it around, we may not value those transfers as much as you may value them, and so I guess kind of a hybrid of more restrictions on our hiring and transfers. I'd like to see all of our open heads and new heads that were previously approved by department to stay within those departmental budgets. And should they be a need or a desire to transfer headcount from one department previously approved and move to another, that we come back to the council and have that conversation.
Councilman, I can respect that. I'll have that summary for you before tomorrow evening.
Okay. And I think the city manager said earlier, final point, is that we could get the actuals, which I too have been asking for, because it's really hard to see if from budget to budget, are we really, really, really growing? You're not really stating the real growth in our plan. And we've got some heads that were open for 3 years, one of them. That was one of the director positions, administrative director, for example. Yeah, I would really like to see how much. Yeah, I'd really like to see what are we growing in our budget? What's the expense increase from a combination of 19 actuals through September 2020, and then of course we have 3 months of estimate, which is not going to skew the numbers much. That number, by at least department, some level that shows us that are we growing? How much are we growing? Is it a 20% growth from our baseline actuals from the prior biennium? And if the answer is it's a big, if it's 20%, then I think we have to have a conversation. And part of the conversation is we had lower head count, or we didn't hire all the positions, and we didn't get this work done. And that forces us to reassess the level of service and statement of work for those departments. Well, we didn't do it. Did we get in trouble? Did we get a fine? Did we get a penalty? Those are the conversations we need to have, the hard conversations that drive a budget that really reflects our needs. And I absolutely agree with what Councilmember Stewart, I think she's saying exactly the same thing, that we do something to that for our conversation to find, because it's really hard for us to say we want. I'm very uncomfortable raising taxes without knowing that answer. I don't want to say I'm increasing my expense from the prior biennium by 20%, and to get there to raise taxes. That's irresponsible. We need that data. We need that transparency.
We're trying to sort it out for you.
Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, I think, we're kind of going back around, but I think to kind of sum up what I'm hearing, we are sailing into an economic headwind. And until the virus is under control, we don't know when recovery is really going to start and take hold. And while this region has done reasonably well, we don't know if that's going to last. We don't know if this is going to be like a 2008 recovery where it's going to be super slow. If, in fact, the virus gets worse, as predicted over the next couple of months, we could see another big pullback. So I really feel like, and I want to go on record as saying I have, for the entire time I've been on council, I've been incredibly supportive of staff, and I worry when they are understaffed, and I do not want to overwork our staff, and that is not my intention here. Again, that being said, we are sailing into an economic headwind. This does not feel like the right time to be converting contract positions to FTE or even LTE positions, right? I do have concerns that we converted our communications positions to FTEs. I'd much rather terminate a contract than lay off an employee. And in looking through, a lot of my questions in the matrix were, when you look at the disproportionate increase in the benefits costs, this maybe, again, isn't the time to be converting contract positions to employees. So I feel like maybe Councilmember Ritchie is onto something, and I think Councilmember Ross, you just kind of said the same thing. I would like to see us start with the budget we have today. Start with where we are right now and show us specifically what you want to add and what are the, like, we have to add, and what are the, if we didn't add this, here's what we would give up. Because before we raise taxes by an unprecedented amount in the middle of, actually maybe not even the middle, maybe the beginning of an economic downturn, which will last some undetermined amount of time, I think we really need to see that. Oh, sorry. And I think we need to, hold on, I gotta go, let the dog out. Sorry.
Well, at least I know how that goes. Yeah, I think Councilmember Stewart was kind of summing up what I think, we've all kind of said, and I haven't mentioned the actuals versus budgeted numbers that we have, but I would concur with my fellow council members who've honed in on that, because it really is important, especially for us as elected officials, if we are to consider a tax increase on our residents here. And while I understand that the 11% of bank capacity doesn't amount to a lot of money, it's relative to your personal situation, and we don't know what everyone's personal situation is right now in the middle of this. So it's uncomfortable to say yes to all of the bank capacity without really understanding what we spent over the last biennium with actual numbers rather than budgeted ones. So, Mr. City Manager, I know you said you're going to bring that back tomorrow, so that will be very helpful, I think, for the full council, and we can kind of wade through those numbers at that time. So, Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
I did. Trials and tribulations of working from home. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I really do think it's important, too, because while it may be traditional for us to, show headcount budgeted for an entire year, this is not a typical situation. And if we know, for example, that we're not going to have, and Anjali, I apologize, I'm going to pick on you for a moment. We're probably not going to do our big Easter celebration at City Hall this year. So have we budgeted for that? Does that include, some operational expenses in there? Does that include, assuming we needed to bring on some seasonal employees at that time for that, when in fact maybe we don't need to bring the seasonal employees on until later because we're probably not going to have a big to-do at City Hall that early. So I do think we really need to look at 2021 very differently than we've probably looked at other years. And so again, starting with here's where we are today and what do we have to add, and also understanding like some of the IT expenses, because I know when we had we purchased a lot of IT equipment because we had some challenges back when we had the attack, and I know that we purchased a lot of IT equipment this year for the pandemic. So really understanding what are those other additional IT expenses? Is that to continue to support this? Is that money that we could be getting reimbursed for? Because the other thing we haven't shown in here is any of the CARES reimbursement money. So I'm a little bit concerned that we're showing this difference when I do think that some of that additional expenditure is money that we will get reimbursed for as well. So again, before we raise taxes to cover a gap, are we actually getting some of that funding? And I did also notice one other thing was that it looks like we're accounting for an FTE position for the emergency manager, but we also have a contract for the emergency manager. So again, I don't think we have any plans of changing that. So unless we're planning on hiring an internal FTE for the emergency manager, we should be reducing that out of the budget and reducing that head count so we're not double counting that expense. I think just sorting through all of that and getting us to that comfort level, I think will be very helpful before we have to make a decision on if we're going to raise taxes or not.
Okay. Yeah, on the emergency manager, we're taking steps to remove that and move the contract amount to other professional services.
All right. So I think we have a pretty strong consensus then that's what we need to kind of start tomorrow night's discussion with. Is that reasonable to get that for tomorrow night?
We're going to do our best to have that. We'll recap what we've done tonight, and then we'll have additional information for you. Because we need to catch the other three up. We need to catch the other.
Starting with the actuals from where we are would be great.
Okay, so Council, I don't see anyone else in the chat. So are there any additional comments? Jason, I'll circle back to you again first if you have anything else to add here.
Not at this point. I appreciate everything everybody and the staff and my fellow council members put into the conversation tonight and to the presentation. Look forward to speaking with everybody tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Ross, did you have anything else?
No, I'm good. I think we've given staff a challenge, so let's get some sleep.
Councilmember Stewart, anything else?
No, I'll just echo the thanks to staff. We know that we ask a lot of you, and we really appreciate all that you do. Thank you.
Okay, I'm good as well with my questions. I think we'll have some ground to cover tomorrow at our meeting on this, but appreciate staff jumping in for an extra meeting this week just to give us an opportunity to have a discussion amongst ourselves on the budget. So thank you. Appreciate that. Unfortunately, I have to pause my thing so I can get back into the packet.
Do we have to motion for adjournment, or is this more of a
We do, but I just wanted to scroll down and make sure there wasn't anything else we needed to cover. There's nothing under city manager reports or council reports, but I wanted to ask just in case.
No, I don't believe we have anything else. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. So
motion to adjourn.
I'll second that. Okay. All right. Been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Have a good.
By a vote of 4-0, we are adjourned. Thanks all.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.